I was going over the 10K for General Motors, and I noticed that their accounts receivable had gone from $43 billion to $53 billion between 2017 and 2018. But during the same time frame, the allowance for doubtful accounts actually went down. And that surprised me a little bit because I said, wait a minute, if accounts receivable is going up, what does that mean? That means that General Motors has more and more customers that are owing them money. Okay, they're making sales on credit. Customers are owing them money, so accounts receivable goes up. But the more accounts receivable goes up, you would think you would estimate there would be more uncollectible accounts potentially. That's what allowance for doubtful accounts is. The more credit sales you make, the more you expect that, hey, I'm never going to collect some of those credit sales. So it was kind of this paradox of accounts receivables going up, and yet their allowance for doubtful accounts actually went down. So I dug a little deeper. I took a look at Note 5 in their 10K, and here's what I found. So they've got two types of receivables. They have retail receivables and commercial receivables. Retail receivables have to do with somebody walks into a GM dealership and they purchase a vehicle and they buy it on credit. Now, actually, General Motors has a GM Financial, and GM Financial purchased the contract from the GM dealership, but those details really aren't that important. The basic mechanics is this. There's a consumer who buys a GM vehicle on credit, and General Motors ultimately ends up having this account receivable as they're waiting to collect the car payments, right, from the customer. But then they also have commercial receivables, and commercial receivables are when General Motors is actually providing financing to the GM dealers so the dealership can acquire inventory. And what is inventory? Well, GM vehicles. Okay, so they're providing financing to the dealers so they can get the actual vehicles on the car dealership lots. So one reason that there might have been this paradox where you say, okay, account receivable went up and yet allowance for doubtful accounts went down, you might say, well, wait a minute, they have two different types of receivables, so maybe there was a change. Maybe one of those types of receivables is less risky than the other, and there was a shift. Maybe, and you would be correct if you were thinking there was a difference in risk among the different types of receivables, because at least according to General Motors has estimated as of 2018, so they break out their receivables by, we've got retail here, and then we've got commercial, and so the gross receivables for each is right here, and then we've got the total. So, and then we've got the allowance for uncollectible accounts for each, and then the net receivables. So if you were to go and calculate out for the retail receivables, the percentage of the receivables that is expected to be uncollectible, so you take the 844 and divide it by 40,568. By the way, all these numbers are in millions. So you end up with 2.1%. So the retail receivables are expected 2.1%. The GM's thinking they're never going to collect that money from those consumers. Okay. Now the commercial receivables is a lot lower percent. This is actually less than 1%. So 0.5%. So it's a very low estimate of uncollectible debt for the commercial. So they're expecting that, look, they're going to get most of that money from the dealer. So that's not going to be an issue. At least that's what GM thinks. So there is a difference, a significant difference in the risk of the different types of receivables. And if we look at the change, we see that between 2017, so we got the 2017 balance sheet date and 2018 balance sheet date, we see that the amount of receivables for commercial went up significantly, almost by a third. I mean, it's a significant amount, maybe close to 25% or so. So it's a significant amount from almost 10 billion to over 12 billion. Okay, so that's about, maybe 22% increase. So there's a significant increase there of commercial receivables, and those ones are less risky. But there's also an increase if we look at the retail receivables. So let's take a look. So we went from 32.7 billion gross to 40.5 billion. So an increase of about maybe 25% of the retail receivables. So what is that? Why does that matter? It's saying that the reason that the receivables went up and yet they had less allowance for doubtful accounts is not just because, oh, well, they have more commercial receivables and those are less risky. That's not the reason. So let's dig deeper and let's just look specifically at these retail receivables. Retail receivables, if you look at 2017, the percent that was estimated to be uncollectible was 2.7%. And so that went down significantly. So 2.7% to 2.1%, that is responsible for the decline in the allowance for doubtful accounts. Now, was this justified or not? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But you might be wondering, well, who cares about this? Well, number one, it's going to affect the net accounts receivable on the balance sheet, the amount that's estimated to be uncollectible. But also remember that it's going to affect the income statement. So here's some other data I pulled from GM. So we've got, they basically reconcile the allowance for bad debt beginning to the end of the period. But let's just focus on this right here, provision for loan losses. That's the journal entry to record bad debt expense. So we're going to record $642 million of bad debt expense in 2018. And this is the journal entry that would have happened. So this right here, the bad debt expense, that's going to affect the income statement. So that's going to affect the company's profitability. So if they estimate a lower percentage of uncollectible accounts, that's going to reduce the bad debt expense and potentially increase General Motors operating profit. So all companies always have an incentive to underestimate the amount of uncollectible accounts because that will increase the company's profit in the current period. I'm not saying that's what General Motors did, but I'm just saying that would be the incentive. Now, how do we know whether when they reduced from 2.7% for the retail receivables to 2.1%, how can we know that that's justified? Well, fortunately, GM provides some other disclosures. They actually tell us the percentage of retail receivables that are more than 30 days past due. And for 2017, that was 5.8%. So 5.8% of all the receivables, they were delinquent. It'd been more than 30 days that the people hadn't made a payment. But it actually went down to 4.7% in 2018. So that would lend some credibility to General Motors' action of saying, okay, they were going to reduce the allowance for doubtful accounts from 2.7% uncollectible to 2.1% over that time period. It could be because they see that there's a higher percentage of people that are paying because the delinquent amount actually went down. Right, so the delinquent amount went from 5.8% to 4.7%. So if more people are paying, if fewer people are delinquent on their car loans, then that could be that they say, okay, well, now we should reduce the amount of accounts that we expect to be uncollectible. So even though the receivables are going up, as they're making more credit sales, the percentage of those receivables that are going to be uncollectible is going down, because they're saying, look, we're expecting more of these people are going to pay because that's what we're seeing from the car payments. And that would explain the paradox of how the account receivable could go up and yet the allowance for uncollectible accounts go down. If you want to learn more about this, in the description section below, I'll have a link to an article.